So actually, just to take a step back on the checklist, one of the things I did not want to do with the checklist was to just blue sky think about things that are good to think about as an investor when you're making an investment. I did not want to create a checklist in that way. What I wanted to do with the checklist was to create it based on real losses that some great investor had because they missed something elementary. And so every investor, no matter how good they are, has plenty of mistakes they're going to make. In fact, John Templeton says that if you're right 2 out of 3 times in the investing business, you're going to hit the ball way, way, way out of the park. So the good news of this business is you can have a very healthy error rate and still do quite well. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And so what I had done when we were creating the checklist was to look at permanent losses of capital that had occurred amongst investors that I had a great deal of respect for, and then try to reverse engineer why those losses might have occurred. And the easiest ones to do on that front were Buffett and Charlie Munger, because they talk so much about their mistakes. And many other investors don't talk about their mistakes at all, and some fall in the middle. So in some cases, I had to kind of reverse engineer what I thought the mistake may have been. But in other cases, like with Berkshire, when I looked at Dexter Shoes or US Air or them buying Berkshire Mills and all these different investments they made, or NetJets, for example, the nature of the mistake was obvious, and therefore coming up with a checklist question was easy. Some of the other ones took a little bit more work, but we were able to get there. Before the financial crisis, Longleaf Partners had invested in General Motors, and they, of course, eventually GM went bankrupt. Of course, they lost a lot of money on that investment. And ironically, now I have an investment in GM, but it's not your father's GM anymore. The checklist questions came out of real failures that I had in investments that had gone south for Pabrai funds and other great investors had. And so we ended up with a list of 90 odd questions. So I wasn't particularly planning that the checklist should go in one direction or the other. It was really driven by the mistakes and what those questions were. And then when I reordered the checklist by category, what surprised me is that how beautifully they fell into a few different categories. So there's a significant number of questions, I think more than 20 plus questions, maybe 25 questions, which relate to various types of leverage and failures related to leveraged things. Then there's another section that relates to moats and competitive advantage, shrinking moats or non-existent moats, or, mistakes made in thinking about the moat and such. There's a lot of questions around that. Like Dexter Shoes in Berkshire's case Warren made a mistake about that moat. Then there's another section that is on management and ownership. What percent of the company does management own, how they compensated, how aligned are their interests. So all these questions related to management and ownership. And then we get to, some miscellaneous areas like, unions, organized labor, environmental issues, and things like that. But the top 3 or 4 categories basically took up most of those questions. And those are the most important things you would think about. You would think about leverage. You definitely would spend a lot of time thinking about moats and competitive advantage. And you definitely want to spend a lot of time thinking about the folks who were running the show and, what types of people in history and such that they had. And so to me, it was surprising how most of the mistakes were in those areas. Yeah, I think when I made the checklist, the biggest number of questions on the checklist relate to leverage, and which means that the most failures that most people had in their investments was because something went wrong with leverage. And so I think that in general, I think you need to pay a lot of attention to how businesses are financed and how conservative they are on that financing. And yeah, so I think that in my case, what would happen is that the checklist would throw up all sorts of red flags in the case of a business that's highly levered. So, what matters is, with leverage, is it recourse, is it non-recourse, is it at the plant level or corporate level? How stable are the cash flows versus the leverage? What kind of multiples do you have on those cash flows versus your interest payments and all that? So all those things, I think, matters. I think being a good credit analyst is a huge advantage. So yes, I think you need to pay attention. And ideally, you want to look for businesses which generate these large cash flows with virtually no leverage. I think the question I try to ask myself is that, was it obvious before the investment was made that this was a possible failure point and a significant failure point, and not something obscure, just headlights front and center. And if you look at Dexter Shoes, can the business be decimated by cheap foreign competition? That's a question on the checklist. When I looked at Longleaf Partners and their investment in GM, they had a lot of commentary when they owned the stock at the time when they're bullish on the stock. And they were bullish because, the big three automakers in the US dominated the truck business. And they still do. They dominated it at a time Longleaf owned it, and they still dominate truck. In fact, they dominated it in a very incredible way. And those trucks actually are just cash cows. I think these guys are making like $10,000 a truck. It's very high profit margins on those trucks. And so that's a great franchise. And, Longleaf focused on the power of the franchise. And they were right. The trucks have a great franchise, but there's other layers in that business. The unions, the labor relations, the high capex nature, and those should have been major red flags. And of course, one of the things that happened with GM post bankruptcy is that Detroit used to be one of the worst places on the planet to build a car in, let's say, 2003 to 2007, for example. Very high labor costs and all these very highly inflexible labor. In fact, labor was not a variable input into manufacturing in US autos. It was a fixed cost. So if GM and Ford did not need a worker, the UAW contracts required them to pay them full pay while they sat at home. And full pay was, with benefits approaching $60, $70 an hour. So, how do you compete against people who are making $5 a day with those sorts of labor costs? And so, in the case of Longleaf, to me, it was obvious that the main thing you should have focused on there, or they should have focused on there, would have been the issues related to labor and capital intensity and such. And of course, then the big three had other problems with quality and other things with their non-truck offerings. So these are, and I don't want to beat up on Longleaf. I'm just using that as an example. I think they're exceptional investors. But these are just some examples that stood out. And in many, many cases, when investors made mistakes, we couldn't tell. I couldn't tell what the failure point was. So we, just like when Baupost makes an investment in some pharmaceutical company, I can't figure out why. And so if they lose money, I also can't figure out why. And that's fine. You don't need to know all of them. When we were doing the checklist, we needed to just understand enough to build a decent list.